At 53, Manny Ramirez exists in a space that few athletes ever truly understand. He is too iconic to disappear, yet too controversial to be embraced without hesitation. His name still sparks emotion, admiration, frustration, nostalgia, but rarely peace. And that is what makes his story so heartbreaking, because Manny's tragedy was never about a single mistake or one explosive scandal. It was about how a once effortless genius slowly became trapped inside the version of himself the world decided to remember. From the very beginning, Manny was different. Watching him hit felt unnatural, almost unfair. The ball seemed to wait for his bat. Pitchers could execute the perfect plan, locate the pitch exactly where they wanted it, and still watch it rocket into the gap or disappear over the wall. Manny didn't attack baseball with rage or intensity. He played it like a language he had spoken since birth. There was no visible strain, no force violence, just rhythm, balance, and an ease that made greatness look ordinary. And that ease would quietly become his curse. Because when something comes naturally, people assume it costs nothing. They don't see the hours, the focus, or the emotional weight of expectation. With Manny, greatness was never praised as work. It was treated as an obligation. Fans didn't hope he would be elite, they demanded it. Every season without domination felt like a betrayal. Every at-bat that didn't end in damage felt like a failure. And when Manny didn't perform rage or intensity the way other stars did, the narrative began to turn. That narrative found a name, Manny being Manny. At first, it sounded playful, almost affectionate. A missed cutoff throw, a moment of distraction in the outfield, a smile when others stayed stone-faced. The phrase made fans laugh, but also reduced a complex human being into a caricature. Over time, it stopped being a joke and became a label, then a judgment. Manny wasn't quirky anymore. He was careless. He wasn't relaxed. He was lazy. He wasn't different. He didn't care. And once that perception hardens, there is no winning. If Manny smiled, critics said he wasn't serious. If he stayed quiet, they said he was hiding something. If he defended himself, they called him selfish. His personality didn't fit the polished, media-trained mold modern sports demanded, and instead of allowing space for difference, the system punished it. Manny communicated best through his bat, but when the conversation shifted off the field, he was always one step behind, misunderstood in a world that confuses silence with guilt. Then came the moment that changed everything. Performance-enhancing drug suspensions didn't just damage Manny Ramirez's reputation. They rewrote his entire legacy in the public mind. Overnight, the discussion stopped being about what he did and became about what he really was. The swing that once inspired awe was re-examined with suspicion. The numbers that once felt historic were labeled tainted. The joy that once defined him was reframed as arrogance. In the court of public opinion, nuance vanished. There was no room for complexity, no patience for explanation, and Manny, never skilled at controlling his own narrative, was swallowed by the worst version of it. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but something quieter and more painful. Manny didn't storm away from the game in defiance. He didn't reinvent himself as a media personality or try to rewrite history with loud apologies. Instead, he kept playing. Different teams, different leagues, different countries. To outsiders, it looked desperate, even embarrassing. But underneath, it was something far more human, a man clinging to the one place where life still made sense. When you've been defined by a gift since your youth, walking away from it doesn't feel like growth. It feels like erasure. The stadium lights faded. The clubhouse noise disappeared. The phone stopped ringing the way it once did. And suddenly, Manny Ramirez was left alone with memories louder than the present. The world moved on, but his identity hadn't caught up yet. He was no longer the man pitchers feared, yet he was still Manny in his own mind, still searching for the rhythm, the connection, the feeling that once made everything clear. This is what makes Manny Ramirez's story truly heartbreaking. Not that he fell, not that he was flawed, but that a player who gave baseball so much joy was never allowed to be fully human in return. He became a debate instead of a person, a warning instead of a legacy. And at 53, he remains caught between who people think he was, and the quiet reality of who he is now. Still smiling, still remembered, but never quite at peace. And that lack of peace didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, almost politely, as the world stopped asking Manny Ramirez what he wanted and started telling him what he was. After the suspensions, the game didn't slam the door in his face. It did something far colder. It cracked the door just enough to remind him of what he was losing, then waited to see how long he would keep knocking. Every opportunity came with an asterisk. Every return felt temporary. Manny was no longer a star reclaiming his place. He was a risk teams tolerated, a headline they hoped wouldn't explode. For the first time in his life, his talent wasn't enough on its own. That's a shock very few people understand. When your entire identity has been built on being exceptional, being told that excellence now comes with conditions feels like humiliation. Manny wasn't fighting pitchers anymore. He was fighting doubt, other people's and his own. And doubt is a much harder opponent because it never gets tired. He tried to adapt. He tried to stay ready. He tried to prove that the love for the game was real, that it had always been real. But the conversation around him had already moved on. Fans didn't ask whether he could still hit. They asked whether he deserved another chance. Analysts didn't debate his mechanics. They debated his morality. And Manny, who had never been comfortable explaining himself, watched as others narrated his life without him. This is where the tragedy deepens, because baseball is more than a job. It's routine. It's belonging. It's a place where time is measured in innings instead of years. When Manny lost that structure, he didn't just lose a paycheck, he lost the rhythm that kept his world steady. That's why he kept going league after league, country after country. Not to chase glory, but to chase familiarity. The sound of the ball hitting the bat. The smell of the grass. The brief moment when everything made sense again. To outsiders, it looked like refusal to let go. To Manny, it was survival. Meanwhile, his legacy hardened into something sharp and uncomfortable. Conversations about him rarely began with awe anymore. They began with disclaimers. Yes, he was great, but became the standard introduction to his name. Highlights were always followed by reminders. Praise was always paired with suspicion. The joy he once brought into the game became complicated, conditional, almost apologetic. And perhaps the cruelest part is that Manny never stopped being Manny. He never turned bitter in public. He never launched a war against the media. He never demanded sympathy. He smiled the same way. He laughed the same way. But the world interpreted that smile differently now. What once looked like innocence was recast as indifference. What once looked like joy was reframed as arrogance. The same personality, judged under a harsher light, suddenly meant something else. This is the invisible cost of falling from grace. You don't just lose status. You lose control of your own story. At 53, Manny Ramirez doesn't live in headlines anymore, but he lives in memory, and memory can be unforgiving. For some fans, he will always be the swing, the power, the magic that made baseball fun. For others, he will always be the cautionary tale. And for Manny himself, he is likely still reconciling those two versions, trying to understand how both can exist inside the same life. The tragedy isn't that Manny Ramirez wasn't perfect. It's that perfection was never the standard for anyone else, but it became the standard he was punished for failing to meet. He gave the game brilliance, laughter, and moments that can't be replicated. Yet when the applause faded, what remained was a long silence filled with judgment. And silence, for someone who once made stadiums roar, can be the loudest heartbreak of all. And as the years passed, the conversation around Manny Ramirez didn't soften. It froze. It became fixed in talking points, recycled every time his name resurfaced, especially when Hall of Fame ballots were released. For most players of his caliber, that stage of life is meant to be a celebration, a final affirmation that the game remembers what you gave it. For Manny, it became another courtroom where strangers debated his worth. On paper, the numbers scream inevitability. The power, the consistency, the fear he put into pitchers for nearly 2 decades. The postseason moments. The championships. The kind of offensive dominance that doesn't appear by accident and doesn't disappear when convenient arguments are made against it. But numbers don't exist in isolation anymore. They live inside narratives, and Manny's narrative had already been decided for many voters before the discussion even began. That's the quiet cruelty of legacy debates. They pretend to be objective, but they're emotional, they're moral, they're personal. And once a player is branded as complicated, his achievements stop standing on their own. They have to apologize first. So Manny's name appears on ballots and disappears again, year after year, never quite embraced, never fully dismissed. Not honored, not erased, just suspended. For someone who spent his life swinging freely, that kind of limbo is its own punishment. It says, you were great, but not comfortable, memorable, but inconvenient. What makes this especially heartbreaking is that Manny never chased immortality. He wasn't obsessed with speeches or plaques. He didn't build his identity around being admired forever. He didn't want a hit, to feel that connection, to live inside that small, perfect moment when bat meets ball and the world goes quiet for half a second. Everything else, the fame, the money, the noise, was secondary. And yet, those secondary things ended up defining how he's remembered far more than the purity of his gift. At 53, Manny Ramirez exists largely outside the public eye, but not outside judgment. Fans still argue about him online. Analysts still reduce his career to a single word, tainted, as if a life can be neatly summarized that way. Very few ask what it costs a person to carry that label forever. Very few consider how exhausting it must be to know that no matter how much joy you once gave, the ending is what people fixate on. This is where the real tragedy settles in. Manny didn't lose everything. He still has his memories, his family, his moments, but he lost control of the story people tell about him. He became a lesson instead of a legacy, a warning instead of a celebration. And that's a heavy burden for someone whose greatest crime, in many ways, was never learning how to be anything other than himself. Because Manny Ramirez was never built to play politics. He was built to play baseball. And when baseball stopped loving him back, there was no backup plan for his soul. That's the part that hurts the most. Not the suspensions, not the debates, not even the missed honors, but the idea that a man who once made millions smile now lives with a legacy that feels unresolved, unfinished, and permanently questioned. And maybe that's the final heartbreak of Manny Ramirez. Not that he fell short of perfection, but that perfection was demanded of him long after the game stopped demanding it from anyone else. The quiet that followed Manny Ramirez after the game wasn't just about the absence of applause. It was about the silence within. When someone spends their entire life wrapped in the roar of crowds, it's hard to imagine what happens when the sound fades. The adrenaline of the game, the satisfaction of proving yourself day after day, the connection to the crowd that makes even the loneliest moments feel alive, all of that disappears the moment the bat is put down for good. And that's the part no one truly understands when they see a player like Manny move on from the game. They see the name on the ballot or the interviews about life after baseball, but they don't feel the internal erosion that happens when a player like Manny is forced to become something else. In baseball, athletes are gods, untouchable by time. But when that period ends, they're thrust into a world where nothing is permanent. In that world, Manny Ramirez had to learn who he was when the uniform was no longer his identity. What happens when you're the player who could break any pitch, who could lift an entire stadium to its feet with just a flick of your wrist? What happens when that part of you, your very identity, fades into something quieter, something human? The reality is that most of the world doesn't know how to let go of their legends. They ask for an encore. They ask for a reason to stay in the spotlight when that spotlight no longer exists for you. And for someone like Manny, who always made it look effortless, the transition wasn't just hard, it was soul-searching. The weight of retirement didn't just settle on Manny's shoulders, it enveloped him. With the loss of baseball, Manny was forced to confront everything the game had hidden. The joy that once came so naturally was replaced with doubt. The skill that had once been his passport to admiration was now a reminder of what he couldn't recapture. But there's something even more painful about Manny's journey. He didn't just lose the game. He lost the chance to reconcile with his place in history. He was never given a clean narrative. He never got to stand on the field one last time and hear the crowd chant his name in gratitude, in recognition of his undeniable contribution. Manny never got that closure. Instead, he was left with a legacy that was filled with buts. Yes, Manny was incredible, but yes, Manny changed the game, but, and the word but hung over him like a storm cloud, blotting out the joy of his contributions. When your name is constantly followed by a qualifier, it makes you question whether you ever mattered at all. And this is the silent tragedy of it all. Manny Ramirez's true worth was never measured by the victories, the homers, or the championships. It was measured by the unspoken gap between who he was as a person and who the world wanted him to be. His legacy, in many ways, became a prison of expectations and misunderstandings. Perhaps the most heartbreaking part is that Manny never truly had a chance to clear up the confusion. He never had the opportunity to speak his truth, because by the time he was ready, the world had already decided who he was. Now, at 53, Manny still exists between the lines. He's not the superstar he once was, but he's not just a man who made mistakes. He's still someone who brought joy to the game, someone whose swings were poetry in motion. And maybe that's the ultimate heartbreak, knowing that your essence is defined by others long after you're gone from the field, and yet you're still left with the question, is it enough? There's no redemption in Manny's story, not in the way we typically understand it. There's no grand comeback or final curtain call. But perhaps that's what makes his journey so profoundly human. We expect athletes to be perfect, to keep giving, to never fade. But what happens when they do? What happens when they're no longer the heroes we built them to be? For Manny, the pain is not just in the loss of the game. It's in the quiet struggle to understand where he fits into a world that has already decided. He gave everything to baseball. But what does it mean when baseball no longer seems to need him? And perhaps, in the end, Manny's tragedy is that he was never really allowed to be just Manny, to be human, to make mistakes, to learn, to grow, without the world's magnifying glass. He was forced to carry his imperfections in front of millions, even as they held their applause behind their backs. And that, above all else, is the real heartbreak of a legend who never truly got to retire. At 53, Manny Ramirez's life is quieter now. The roar of the crowd is a distant memory, and the constant shuffle of the game's demands is no longer part of his daily routine. He has retreated from the spotlight, seeking solace in family, personal growth, and perhaps some semblance of normalcy that was once denied to him. But the quiet life that Manny leads now is not without its own challenges. It's the life of a man who has given everything to a game that no longer holds him, and now he must figure out who he is when the world has stopped defining him by his bat. When an athlete is defined by their career, the question that inevitably follows retirement is, who are you without the game? For Manny, it's been a long and winding road. When you're known for one thing for so long, it becomes hard to shake that label, even when you step away. Manny Ramirez was never a man of many words, but his actions on the field spoke volumes. The fear he struck into pitchers, the history he wrote in the postseason, it all speaks for itself. But as the years pass, that legacy becomes more distant, fading into the background as the man behind it struggles to live a life that is not constantly under public scrutiny. The man who once made history with every swing of the bat now finds himself in a different kind of game. One where the stakes are much higher, not in terms of fame or fortune, but in terms of finding peace within himself. He has always been an enigmatic figure, a man whose life was always larger than the game itself. But now, in the quiet of his days, Manny has been forced to confront the parts of himself that he could once ignore, his regrets, his choices, and the pieces of his story that the public never got to see. Manny Ramirez didn't want to be perfect. He didn't want to be a flawless role model or a walking example of discipline. What he wanted was simple, to hit the ball, to bring the joy he found in the game to those who watched him play. But the world doesn't let you be just that. As an athlete, you're expected to be everything: hero, villain, teacher, role model. And when you fail to meet those expectations, the fall is swift, brutal, and unforgiving. So now, with the game behind him, Manny has had to rebuild his sense of self without the familiar framework of the sport. His legacy, once a symbol of unrestrained power, is now a series of debates and reflections. For some, Manny is still the talented, unpredictable player who changed the way baseball was played. For others, he's a cautionary tale, someone who failed to live up to the pristine image the world wanted to place on him. But what does Manny think of it all? What does he see when he looks back on his career and the man he became? Is there regret, anger, or acceptance? Maybe all of it. The reality is that Manny never got the chance to fully shape his own narrative. It was written for him. And while he may never fully reconcile with the way the world sees him, the man behind the player is coming to terms with what his story means. In interviews and fleeting glimpses into his post-baseball life, it's clear that Manny values family more than ever. His focus has shifted from batting practice to spending time with loved ones, from the harsh light of the dugout to the quieter moments of life that once seemed insignificant. In many ways, this is where Manny finds peace, by rediscovering the parts of life that baseball never let him experience fully. There are still questions, of course. What would his legacy have looked like if he had taken a different path? What if he had avoided the suspensions, the controversy, and the misunderstandings? Would his name be enshrined in Cooperstown? Would he be remembered as the greatest hitter of his generation? But as time moves forward, the answers to those questions become less important. What Manny has come to realize is that his life, his worth, cannot be defined by the mistakes he made or the moments that didn't go according to plan. In the end, it's not the mistakes that matter. It's the moments of joy he gave to millions. It's the way he made baseball feel alive. And maybe that's enough. The world may never let go of the narrative they built around Manny Ramirez. But in the quiet of his life now, Manny is learning to live without the weight of public opinion, without the pressure of being perfect. He is Manny, the man, not just Manny, the baseball player. And for the first time in a long while, that might just be enough for him. Manny Ramirez's story isn't finished yet. It may never be fully understood by those who only see him through the lens of baseball. But for Manny, it's not about the Hall of Fame, the home runs, or the statistics anymore. It's about finding peace in the quiet, in the life after baseball, and in accepting that he is more than the player the world tried to define him as. As Manny Ramirez continues to move further away from his days of baseball stardom, the public has largely shifted its attention to other players, other stories, other headlines. But Manny's journey, the one that took him from the heights of baseball royalty to a life in which the noise had settled, continues to evolve in ways that few could have predicted. The final chapters of Manny's career were not defined by grand comebacks or spectacular moments. No farewell tour, no teary-eyed speech on a stage. Instead, it's been a quiet walk into the unknown, something that feels almost cruel for a man who was once so uncontainable, so unmistakable in his greatness. The tragic irony is that, for all the years he spent under the spotlight, it is the silence that now defines his existence. But within that silence, there is growth. Manny is living a life that is increasingly disconnected from the public persona that so defined him. No longer the man the world expected him to be, but someone who is finding his own rhythm in his own time. That might be the most peaceful part of his story, that he's finding peace in his own terms, even if the world doesn't fully recognize the transformation. As the years pass, Manny's reflection on his own legacy has shifted. No longer is he entirely concerned with whether the Hall of Fame will one day call his name. It's become secondary to something more personal. The game he gave his heart to no longer defines him. The moments of pressure, the media frenzy, the performances on the field, those are now memories, and they no longer carry the weight they once did. In his quieter moments, Manny is likely confronted with the question that lingers in the minds of many who once idolized him. Was it worth it? Was the sacrifice, the public scrutiny, the loss of privacy, worth the fleeting moments of glory? But for Manny, these are not questions he needs to answer for anyone but himself. He's learned, perhaps the hard way, that greatness cannot be measured solely by the accolades or the trophies. Sometimes the true measure of a life well lived is found in the peace you create when the applause dies down. Manny's decision to step away from the game, from the public's gaze, has allowed him the space to discover new dimensions of himself. The man who once needed the game to define him now exists outside of it. His new chapters, shaped by family, reflection, and personal growth, are as crucial to his story as the years he spent under the bright stadium lights. But even as Manny steps away from the game, he cannot fully escape the legacy of who he was. It follows him wherever he goes. People still talk about his home runs, his antics, the stories of his time with the Red Sox, the Dodgers, and beyond. And while those moments were undeniably significant, they are only a piece of the puzzle that is Manny Ramirez. What truly matters now is not how the world remembers him, but how he remembers himself. His legacy, still debated in the Hall of Fame voting rooms and on baseball forums, is no longer the primary focus of his life. Instead, he is learning to embrace the fullness of his identity, separate from the expectations of others. He's still Manny, but not the one defined by a bat and a ball. He is the man who wore that name, who brought joy to millions, and who now quietly embraces a different life, far removed from the fame and scrutiny he once knew. There's something deeply human about this. Manny Ramirez's story is not just a cautionary tale of fame lost. It is a testament to the complexity of every life lived in the spotlight. The highs, the lows, and everything in between. For Manny, the greatest victory may not lie in the public's approval or in achieving the pinnacle of baseball's highest honors. It may simply be in finding peace with himself, understanding that he was more than the sum of his errors, his triumphs, and his moments on a field. He is more than what anyone expected him to be. He is Manny Ramirez, a man who found his way, not just as a baseball player, but as a person, and that, perhaps, is the ultimate redemption. Not fame, not glory, but peace with the man you've become after the lights go out. As Manny Ramirez continues to reflect on his journey, his story now becomes more than just a tale of athletic achievement. It's about human resilience and the search for self-understanding. The applause may have faded, the cameras may have turned away, but Manny's story is still unfolding, quietly, away from the public eye. In these quieter years, the legacy of a man who captivated millions on the baseball field begins to transform once more into something that is less about what he did and more about who he is. The peace that Manny seeks in these years, removed from the game he once lived and breathed, isn't always easy to come by. For someone who spent so much of his life with his identity intertwined with the game, the transition to life after baseball could be a disorienting experience. But what Manny has found is that there is more to life than what a career in sports can offer. He's turned inward, focusing on his family, personal growth, and healing. Manny has spoken about the importance of family in his post-baseball years, and it's clear that his relationship with his loved ones is now his greatest source of comfort and strength. In the rush of his career, the love and support of family members often took a back seat to the demands of the game. Now, however, Manny finds fulfillment in these moments that go unnoticed by the larger world. The quiet dinners, the time spent with his children, and the bond that is allowed to grow when he's simply dad instead of Manny Ramirez, baseball superstar. While the world may always remember the home runs and the controversies, Manny's legacy is now also about how he lives in the present. He's not just a figure from the past. He's a man continuing to navigate his own path, learning from the lessons of his past while embracing the quieter joys of today. The man who was once defined by the cheers of millions now defines himself through the love of his family, through the wisdom gained in reflection, and through the contentment he finds in living outside the expectations that once governed his every move. It's in this quiet that Manny truly begins to understand the depth of his own journey, not just as a player, but as a man. The story of his career, so often told by others, is now reframed by him. No longer does he have to answer to the judgment of the public, to the expectations of fans or critics. The man behind the player is finding his own voice, speaking not for approval, but for peace. In interviews, Manny has spoken with a newfound sense of humility, acknowledging his mistakes while expressing gratitude for the lessons learned along the way. It's a side of him that many never saw, a side that was hidden behind the larger-than-life persona of the Manny being Manny character. This quieter, more reflective version of Manny is a testament to the resilience of a man who is still evolving, still growing, even after the game has long since passed him by. Manny may never fully escape the shadow of his legacy as a baseball player, and perhaps he doesn't need to. What truly matters now is that he is not defined by the mistakes or controversies of his past, but by how he has embraced the present. He is learning to live a life where his worth is not based on his performance on the field, but on the love he gives and receives in the spaces that matter most. In many ways, Manny Ramirez's true redemption lies not in the Hall of Fame or in the public's acceptance, but in his ability to move forward, to carve out a new life for himself that is built on the foundation of what he learned during the years of fame, but is not chained to it. The final act of Manny's story is not a return to glory. It's a return to himself. He is now more than the player who once captured the world's attention. He is Manny, the man who is slowly but surely learning to live life on his own terms, with a deep understanding of the imperfections that make him human. And for that, perhaps this is the most fitting legacy of all, one that transcends the field and exists in the quiet moments of a life fully lived.